When I first learned that Russia had issued what Moscow itself described as its most severe warning yet to NATO, I realized the Atlantic Alliance had finally reached a threshold from which there is no diplomatic return. In my 40 years studying international relations and the mechanics of great power conflict, I have never witnessed such a stark convergence of military escalation, institutional rigidity, and strategic miscalculation. What we are watching unfold is not merely another crisis in the long, turbulent history of NATO expansion. We are witnessing the structural collapse of the post-Cold War security architecture in the West's complete inability to recognize it while it happened. Picture this: a military alliance designed in 1949 to contain Soviet communism, which has spent the last 30 years methodically expanding eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact members and Soviet republics, is now shocked, genuinely shocked, that Russia has finally drawn a line and meant it. The warning Russia just issued was not a bluff. It was not diplomatic theater. It was a message from a declining power that has exhausted its patience with American encroachment and has decided that the costs of further accommodation now exceed the costs of confrontation. Let me explain what led us to this moment, and more importantly, why America and its European allies walked directly into a geopolitical trap of their own design. The NATO alliance, in its essence, is a Cold War relic that should have been dissolved when the Soviet Union collapsed. Instead, it did the opposite. NATO expanded. It expanded relentlessly, methodically, and most crucially, it expanded in direct violation of the security assurances that American officials privately gave to Russian leaders during the immediate post-Cold War period. George H. Bush administration promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if the Soviet Union withdrew from Eastern Europe and allowed German reunification. This was not a formal treaty. It was a verbal commitment, and it was broken systematically, one country at a time, for 3 decades. The critical breaking point that Russia has now reached is the moment when Moscow concludes that NATO expansion into Ukraine and potentially Georgia, Moldova, and the Balkans represents an existential threat to Russian security that can no longer be managed through words or diplomatic warning. Russia's severe warning, delivered through military posturing, rhetorical escalation, and strategic repositioning, is its way of saying, we'll fight if you cross this line. We are not bluffing anymore. This is not the beginning of the crisis. This is the culmination of it. This is the moment when Russian patience, already thin after Ukraine 2014, after Crimea, after the NATO expansion into the Baltics, finally snaps. The root cause of this crisis lies not in Moscow. It lies in Washington, in the European Union, bureaucracy in Brussels, and in the collective strategic delusion that has gripped the Western political establishment since. That delusion is simple: the belief that American primacy is permanent, that the uniolar moment will last forever, and that Russia is too weak, too sanctioned, too economically crippled to ever assert itself again as a great power with legitimate security interests. Let me be direct about the American role in this catastrophe. The United States, having won the Cold War, decided that victory was not enough. It decided to expand NATO into Russia's backyard. It decided to encircle Russia with military bases, missile systems, and alliance commitments. It decided to pursue regime change in places like Serbia, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It decided to impose devastating sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, believing that economic pain would force Moscow to back down. And when all of those strategies failed to subdue Russia, when sanctions failed to break the Russian economy, when NATO expansion failed to intimidate Russia into accepting its containment, America doubled down. It sent more weapons. It expanded more alliances. It tightened more sanctions. This is the behavior of a hegemon that has lost its strategic compass. This is the behavior of a power that believes its own mythology so completely that it cannot perceive reality anymore. Russia's severe warning must be understood in this context. It is not an act of aggression. It is an act of self-defense against a power that has been slowly, incrementally, methodically encircling it for 30 years and is now running out of patience. Now, let me explain why Russia's response is logically rational. In fact, it is more rational than anything the Western alliance has done. Russia looks at the map of Eastern Europe and sees what I see. NATO has moved from 16 members in That is a doubling of the alliance's footprint with every expansion moving closer to Russian territory. Russia sees NATO's military infrastructure, missile systems, air defense networks, rapid deployment forces arrayed along its borders. Russia sees weapons flowing into Ukraine with American authorization. Russia sees American officials making statements about containing Russia permanently. From Moscow's perspective, this is not a negotiable situation. This is not a problem that can be solved with more diplomacy or more confidence building measures. Russia is facing the systematic expansion of a hostile military alliance that has made it clear through both words and actions that its goal is to dominate Russian foreign policy, dictate Russian domestic choices, and potentially even threaten Russian territorial integrity. So Russia has made a calculation. It has calculated that the costs of accepting this status quo now exceed the costs of pushing back hard. Russia has calculated that the West is unwilling to stop NATO expansion voluntarily, that sanctions will continue regardless of Russian behavior, and that therefore the only rational response is to make the cost of further NATO expansion so high that the West will think twice. This is not a threat born of aggression. This is a threat born of desperation. The desperation of a great power that sees its strategic position deteriorating and decides that it must act now before it becomes too weak to act at all. Let me place this moment in historical context, because history is the only lens through which we can truly understand what is happening. In 1962, the United States discovered Soviet missile systems in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The American response was to declare this an intolerable threat to American security and to threaten military action if those missiles were not removed. The Cuban Missile crisis brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war. But here is the crucial point. American officials at the time understood viscerally and immediately why the Soviet Union had placed those missiles there. The Soviets had placed them because the United States had placed missiles in Turkey, directed at the Soviet Union. The Soviets understood this as a threat. The Americans understood that the Soviets understood this as a threat. Yet, when the situation was reversed, when Russia viewed NATO as the Cuban Missile Crisis player in their own backyard, the American response was one of bewilderment and accusation. Why is Russia being so aggressive? Why is Russia so paranoid? This is not paranoia. This is the exact same logic that Americans applied in Cuba, now applied from the Russian perspective. Or consider the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, when the United States declared that any attempt by European powers to interfere in the Americas would be considered a threat to American security. The United States did not wait for European armies to invade. The United States declared prophylactically that even the threat of European expansion into America's neighborhood was unacceptable. America was asserting a regional sphere of influence. Russia has essentially declared a Russian version of the Monroe Doctrine for Eastern Europe, and the West has responded with fury and incomprehension. The tragedy of this moment is that NATO could have stopped this at numerous junctures. 1997, when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined. 2004, when the Baltic states and Romania joined. 2022, when Finland and Sweden joined. NATO could have paused, could have negotiated, could have created a genuine security architecture that included Russia rather than excluded it. But NATO did not do this, because NATO has become an institution incapable of strategic adaptation. NATO is locked into a trajectory. NATO's purpose in the minds of American and European policymakers has become synonymous with expansion. Stopping expansion means questioning NATO's reason for existing, and no institution volunteers its own obsolescence. This is why Russia's warning is so severe. Russia is not warning against any single action. Russia is warning against the continuation of a decades-long process that NATO seems incapable of stopping. Russia is saying this process ends now, or we will end it for you. The military dimension of this crisis is worth examining in detail. Russia, despite its economic handicaps and its isolation from Western technology, has managed to modernize its military in ways that directly threaten NATO's operational assumptions. Russia has developed hypersonic missile systems that NATO air defenses cannot reliably intercept. Russia has developed electronic warfare capabilities that degrade NATO's technological advantage. Russia has positioned its military forces not in a posture of peacekeeping, but in a posture of war, fighting along multiple fronts. Ukraine, Belarus, the Black Sea, the Baltic. NATO in response has deployed additional forces to the eastern flank. But here is the crucial point. NATO deployment is reactive. Russian military posturing is preemptive. Russia is saying in military terms, we will fight if you push further. NATO is saying, we will fight if you attack us. But NATO is also saying, and we intend to continue expanding. This creates an unbridgeable gap. One side is drawing a line, the other side is refusing to acknowledge that a line has been drawn. What Russia's warning actually represents is the final institutional acknowledgement that American unipolarity is over. For 30 years, America has operated as though it could make unilateral decisions about the structure of international order. For 30 years, Russia and China have been weak enough, isolated enough that they could be overridden. But that era is finished. Russia's warning is backed by China's growing military power and economic leverage. It is backed by the formation of alternative international institutions that exclude the West, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union. It is backed by the reality that sanctions have not isolated Russia economically. Instead, they have forced Russia to build alternative trade networks with China, India, and the global south. The severe warning that Russia has issued is not merely a warning about NATO, it is a warning that the post-1999 international order in which America makes the rules and everyone else follows is dead, and the West has no strategy for living in a genuinely multipolar world. History will judge this moment with clarity that eludes us now. History will look back at the decision to expand NATO into Ukraine, into Georgia, into the Balkans, and it will render a verdict. This was the moment when a declining hegemon, meant to accept its own decline, made the final strategic blunder that accelerated that decline. Russia's severe warning is not a threat, it is a plea. It is Russia saying, please stop. We cannot live with this. The cost of living with this is higher than the cost of fighting about this. And the West locked into its institutions, its assumptions, its reflex of hostility toward Russia cannot hear that plea. The clock is ticking. The breaking point has been reached. And when the next crisis arrives, and it will arrive, both sides will discover that there is nowhere left to retreat, no diplomatic off-ramp, no face-saving compromise. We are entering a period of great power conflict, not because Russia wants it, but because America has made it inevitable. And that is perhaps the most tragic mistake a hegemonic power can